Welcome to Night Stories from VHS Era. You've arrived at a place where the glow of old television screens, the hum of rewinding tapes, and the softness of forgotten childhood dreams come alive once more. Each night will take a quiet journey back in time to sleepy suburbs, moonlit driveways, warm summer breezes, and the kind of memories that feel just a little too magical to be real. Here you don't need to worry. Just press play and let the night unfold. Before we begin tonight's story, let's take a moment to slow down. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath in through your nose. Hold it gently. And now, exhale slowly through your mouth. Let the day melt away with that breath. Again, breathe in deeply. Feel your shoulders soften. Now, release and let go of everything you don't need to carry right now. Imagine you're lying on a cozy bed in your childhood room. Outside, the wind hums softly. The light from a small lamp glows like a warm memory, and the sound of a distant VHS tape spinning fills the air with comfort. You are safe. You are still. And the night is yours. Let's begin tonight's story.
Do you remember the first time you realized the world was about to change? Have you ever had a moment so simple that it didn't feel like a beginning, but later you'd look back and realize everything started right there? Tonight, I want to take you back to one of those moments. A regular afternoon in the 90s, a casual visit, a cousin's voice, and a living room that felt like the center of the universe for exactly one perfect summer. Stay with me until the end of this video, because by the time we reach the last line of this chapter, you'll understand why I never looked at a television the same way again, and why, for a while, I truly believed I would never leave that screen. It started with nothing extraordinary. My mom had just washed my Nike Windrunner. You know, the one with the teal, purple, and white stripes that made me feel like I could run faster just by wearing it. The smell of fresh laundry filled the house, blending with the faint aroma of Kraft mac and cheese cooling on the counter. Outside, the cicadas buzzed like 1,000 skipping cassette tapes left in the sun too long. It was one of those endless summer days, the kind that seemed to last a week between lunch and dinner. And then the phone rang. Not a cell phone, of course. It was the cordless beige one from the kitchen wall, the kind with the pull-out antenna you had to wiggle sometimes to get a clear signal. My mom answered, then called out with a half laugh. "It's your cousin Mark. He says you have to come over. Something about a game." I remember rolling my eyes. Mark was always finding something. A new trick on his yo-yo, a weird toy from Radio Shack, a rare Pog he swore was worth $10. But something in her voice made me curious. She was amused, not annoyed. That meant it was probably something actually worth seeing. I grabbed my LA Gear sneakers, still glowing faintly from their last stomp, tied them in a hurry, and pedaled my bike the 2 blocks to his place, past the same corner store where we used to buy bubble tape and lemon heads, past the park where our shadows used to stretch like giants at dusk. I didn't know it yet, but something historic was waiting behind that screen door. He met me on the porch like he'd been watching. "You have to see this," he said again, a glint in his eye I'd only seen once before, when he showed me his dad's old Betamax tapes and swore they were better than VHS. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer, just turned and walked inside. The house smelled like pizza rolls and warm carpet. There was a low electronic hum coming from the living room, a sound I didn't recognize, but somehow knew I'd never forget. I stepped into the room and stopped. There, under the old Zenith television, was a gray box I had never seen before. Sleek, strange, almost futuristic. 2 curved controllers lay on the floor like alien artifacts. The screen was paused. A character hovered in the air, frozen mid-jump, with polygons instead of pixels. The lighting, the depth, it was like nothing I had ever seen. "What is this?" I whispered. Mark grinned. "PlayStation." I don't remember sitting down, but I was suddenly on the shag carpet, knees bent, controller in hand. He unpaused the game, Crash Bandicoot, and that was it. That was the moment. The world shifted. Have you ever seen something so new it made your skin tingle? Have you ever felt like your brain couldn't fully grasp what you were seeing? That was me. Watching Crash spin, leap, get chased by boulders. Everything moved around you. It wasn't just left to right. It wasn't side-scrolling anymore. It was like stepping into a toy box and living inside it. I asked him, "Is this a computer game?" "No," he said proudly. "It's a console. Sony made it." "Sony? The people who made our Discman and the boombox in my bedroom? They make games now?" I asked. Mark nodded. "And they're gonna beat Nintendo." That seemed blasphemous. I had Super Mario World. I had Donkey Kong Country. But this was different. I felt it in my chest. I played for hours, barely blinking. The controller felt strange at first, with its rounded shape and 2 shoulder buttons. But by the time the sun dipped behind the trees and the room turned golden with the magic hour light, I had become part of the machine. Crash moved when I moved. He jumped when I asked him to. He lived on that screen, and I lived through him. Do you remember the first time you saw a character move in 3D? Do you remember the way the music looped, hypnotic, rhythmic, pulling you deeper into the experience? That night, I went home changed. I remember walking back as the street lights flickered on, the air smelling of barbecue and lawn clippings, my thoughts still trapped in that jungle with Crash. For the first time, I had seen something that didn't just entertain, it transported. The PlayStation wasn't a toy, it was a doorway. I couldn't sleep. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my posters of Sonic and Batman now feeling strangely two-dimensional and flat. I wanted to go back. I wanted to pick up that controller again, feel the weight of it in my hands, lose myself in a world that wasn't made of pixels, but of shapes and space and possibility. Did you ever have a moment like that, when you realized the future had arrived? That was mine. And even now, after all these years, sometimes when I hear the old PlayStation boot-up sound, that eerie orchestral whoosh, I get goosebumps, because it takes me back to that living room, that summer afternoon, and that one simple sentence: "You have to see this." And I did. I don't think I'll ever forget the exact pitch of that sound. The first time it echoed through my cousin's living room, I felt something in my chest that I couldn't name at the time. A vibration, like a low pulse in the air that seemed to come from somewhere far away and deep inside all at once. It didn't just start like other systems. It arrived. It announced itself. And in doing so, it whispered something ancient and new, something that felt sacred to a child in love with pixels and possibility. The screen had gone black just moments before. We had turned the system off after hours of Crash Bandicoot, our eyes dry and red from staring too long. Mark, always a step ahead of me when it came to electronics, said, "Wait, I want to show you something else." And he popped out the disc and slid in another. Tekken 2. I remember the name. I remember the cracked plastic case with the cover art. Gritty, strange, dark. It looked more like a movie than a game. Then he turned the PlayStation back on. There was a small click, the kind you'd hear from an old VCR when the tape started to roll. And then it happened. First came silence, black screen. Then a soft swell, a distant chime, rising slowly like a foghorn through a dream. And then the sound. That orchestral synthesized breath that began low and grew like a cosmic wave rolling toward us from beyond the stars. And as it reached its peak, a glowing diamond appeared in the center of the screen. It spun, slowly, deliberately, catching the light in a way that made it seem alive. And then, with no warning, the word Sony burst onto the screen in bold white letters. Seconds later, the PlayStation logo faded in, a red P, a yellow, green, and blue S. And in that moment, I wasn't in Mark's living room anymore. Have you ever heard a sound that felt like a doorway? Have you ever seen a logo and known, without question, that it was more than just branding, more than just design, that it was a key? I didn't blink. I barely breathed. It felt like something huge had just entered the room and decided to stay. I asked Mark, was that part of the game? He laughed. No, that's just the startup. Just the startup. I had never heard a console start like that. The Super Nintendo blinked on with a cheerful chime. The Sega Genesis gave you its mechanical S-E-J. But this was like watching the curtain rise at a Broadway theater. This was theatrical, cinematic. It was like being invited to sit down at the front row of something you didn't even know existed. And it was beautiful. Mark was already mashing buttons, eager to show off the fighting game, but I sat there, still dazed by the sound, the motion, the weight of it all. It was like seeing into the future. I remember asking, almost to myself, why does it feel like that? Mark shrugged. It's just how it starts. But it wasn't just anything, not to me. That startup became a ritual over the next few weeks, like lighting a candle before reading a book or saying a prayer before bed. Every time we powered on the system, I would watch. I had to. I couldn't look away. I couldn't imagine skipping it. It wasn't optional. It was part of the experience. Do you know that feeling when something so small becomes so important that you start to depend on it? Like the smell of your favorite childhood blanket, or the sound of your dad's keys hitting the table when he got home from work. That startup sound became that for me. A signal that I was safe, that I was entering a different place, that the day was going to get better. Even now, if I close my eyes and imagine it clearly, I can smell the carpet. I can feel the warmth of the CRT TV buzzing against my knees. I can hear the faint squeak of the analog stick as I rotated in anticipation, waiting for whatever game was next. It wasn't long before I started asking to come over to Mark's house more often, not just to play, but to start. I'd ride my bike in the afternoons and pretend it was just to hang out, but the truth was, I wanted to hear that sound again. I wanted to see that spinning diamond. And one day, I asked him if I could start the console myself. He handed me the controller with a nod. I bent down, pressed the button, and waited. Click. Black screen. Then the swell. I felt like I had opened a gate. By the time Tekken 2 loaded, we were already in the middle of another world. Characters spun and kicked in full 3D. They moved like action figures brought to life, like dreams of movement and control that I didn't yet understand. But even with all the action, all the fighting and sound effects and music and rage, it was that startup that stayed with me. It played in my head long after I'd gone home, while I brushed my teeth, while I stared out the window at night, like a lullaby from the future, or maybe from some version of the present that had just arrived, wrapped in gray plastic and plugged into a zenith. Do you remember your first ritual? The first thing you did over and over, not because you had to, but because it meant something? That was mine. We didn't talk about it much. Mark thought it was just a system boot. But to me, it was like hearing a choir every time I pressed the button. And the more I heard it, the more I realized I didn't want to go back to a world without it. That summer, everything else faded away. I stopped watching cartoons in the morning. I stopped bringing my Game Boy to family dinners. Even my Walkman, with its orange foam headphones and the Backstreet Boys cassette I had played to death, began collecting dust. I had a new song now, and it only lasted a few seconds. But those few seconds, they meant everything. I used to lie in bed at night and try to hum it. I'd whisper it into the quiet, trying to recapture the way it rose, the way it lingered in the air. But it was never quite the same without the screen, without the glow, without the room dark and filled with possibility. Sometimes I wonder, was it just me? Was I the only kid who felt like that startup screen was speaking directly to him? Or were there others out there, kneeling in front of glowing screens, waiting for that diamond to spin, that logo to fade in, that sound to lift them just a little closer to the future? Even now, so many years later, I hear it sometimes in my dreams. That tone, that rise, that soft chime. And I remember the warmth of Mark's house, the hum of the fan in the corner, the echo of the CRT buzz just before the disc began to spin. And most of all, I remember the feeling, the one that told me something incredible was about to happen. And it always did. There are moments that quietly split your life into before and after. They don't arrive with fireworks. They don't announce themselves with fanfare. They slip in softly, like fog under a door. And only later do you realize that everything changed in their wake. For me, one of those moments was the first time I saw 3D graphics that felt alive. It wasn't just another game. It was something else entirely. It happened during one of those long summer afternoons when time slowed down, when the sun hung lazily in the sky like it had nowhere to be. Mark had just returned from the video rental store 2 blocks from his house. He came back with a thin black case that looked more serious than the others. I remember how careful he was, how his hands trembled a little when he slid the disc out. He didn't say much, just looked at me and said, "This one's different." I didn't know what he meant. We had already played games with spaceships and ninjas and racing cars. What could possibly be so different? He pressed the button. The screen flickered. The diamond spun. That familiar orchestral swell filled the room again, and already I felt something stir in my chest. The PlayStation logo appeared, but what followed wasn't what I expected. No cartoony characters, no flashing logos, just silence. Then, slowly, a line of text faded in. A Hideo Kojima game. It meant nothing to me at the time, but what came after changed everything I thought I understood about what games could be. The game was Metal Gear Solid. It started in darkness, with the camera panning over digital water. Rain fell. The screen wasn't trying to impress me with color or movement. It was quiet, controlled, cinematic. Then, the camera zoomed in on a man in scuba gear, slipping silently through the water, moving like something alive. The game hadn't even really started yet, and already I felt something shift inside me. I leaned forward, not because I was excited, but because I had to. It was instinct. The way you lean forward when someone starts whispering a secret. Mark sat beside me, unusually still. His controller rested in his hands like a sacred object. He didn't mash buttons, he didn't shout. He just watched. And so did I. The man on screen climbed out of the water. Lights flickered, shadows danced, and the camera followed him like it was being held by a real person, not programmed by a machine. Everything moved like it belonged to a larger world. There were no bright icons, no cheerful jingles, just footsteps, metallic and distant. And a voice, calm, serious, real. Solid Snake. He didn't sound like the characters I was used to. He didn't talk like someone in a game. He sounded like someone I had overheard on a police scanner or in a late-night thriller. And when the camera cut to his face, angular, pixelated, but somehow human, I froze. I didn't blink. I literally forgot to blink. His eyes were barely visible, his face made of jagged polygons, and yet there was something in his presence, in his voice, in the way he moved. I felt like I was watching a man who existed. I whispered, almost without realizing it, "He looks real." Mark nodded. We played for hours that day, but not in the way we usually did. There was no chaos, no wild laughter. We played quietly, thoughtfully. Every corridor we crept through felt heavy with tension. Every sound, a guard's footsteps, the crackle of a radio, made my pulse quicken. And then there were the moments when Snake would stop moving, and the camera would linger just a second longer than it needed to, as if it were asking me, "Do you see what this is? Do you understand what's happening here?" I didn't understand, not fully, but I felt it. We weren't just playing a game. We were participating in something, experiencing something that lived in between film and interactivity. It wasn't just a mission, it was a world, a space with rules and history and consequences. I remember hiding in a cardboard box to avoid detection. At first, it was funny, but then the realism returned. The guards searched, they talked, they called for backup. This was no arcade, this was war. Fictional, sure, but it felt real. More real than anything I had ever played before. That night, when I finally biked home under the pink-orange sky, the streets felt different. Everything looked a little more detailed, a little sharper, as if my eyes had learned a new way to look. I noticed the way the sunlight hit the sidewalk cracks, the pattern of rust on a mailbox, the sound of my own breath. I realized something strange. The game hadn't pulled me away from reality. It had changed how I saw it. I lay awake in bed that night, playing the game over again in my mind. Snake's movements, the voices, the music, subtle, haunting. I thought of the vents and shadows and snowflakes. I thought of how the camera had lingered on the base at Shadow Moses. And I realized I had felt more tension, more curiosity, more fear than I ever had watching a movie. Why was it so powerful? Because for the first time, I felt like I wasn't watching a story. I was in one. And more than that, it was a story that trusted me to be quiet, to listen, to think, to feel. Games had always been fun, but this was something else, something deeper, something that made me sit with the controller resting in my lap and forget where I was, forget the time, forget everything except the sound of the snow crunching under boots and the voice of a man with a past I didn't yet know how to understand. That was the night my idea of reality changed. Because if a bunch of polygons and code could make me feel that much, then maybe reality wasn't just what I saw. Maybe it was what I believed. Maybe reality was something that lived not just out in the world, but inside me too. And once that door opened, it never closed again. I started seeing potential in every dark hallway, in every pause between lines of dialogue, in every cutscene and every camera angle. The next games we played didn't just entertain me, they haunted me, they stayed with me. And it all began with that one silent startup, that one underwater mission, that one moment of pure, breathless immersion. It was the day a game shattered my sense of what was possible, and I'm still putting the pieces together. It's funny how something can look so small in your hands and still feel enormous. That was exactly how I felt the first time I held a PlayStation controller. It was light, almost delicate, but as I wrapped my fingers around it, I realized I had no idea what I was doing. It might as well have been a spaceship's control panel. The shapes, circle, cross, square, triangle, weren't just buttons, they were symbols. Mysterious, silent, and completely foreign, like ancient runes. Mark made it look effortless. His fingers moved with the confidence of someone who had already memorized the language. He pressed things and made things happen. I pressed things and caused accidents. In the game, Snake would suddenly crouch when I meant to aim or stand still while guards spotted him. I didn't even know how I was doing it. The controller was in my hands, but the game felt like it was somewhere else entirely, like it didn't quite trust me yet. And yet, something inside me sparked. Even when I failed, even when Snake was captured, or alarms blared, or the screen faded to black with a cold, judgmental "game over," I felt something I had never felt before in front of a TV. Not shame, not frustration, but wonder. Pure, unfiltered wonder. Because every wrong button was still a button that did something. Even when I messed up, the game responded. It acknowledged me. I was used to TVs that only talked to me. This one listened. That changed everything. I remember one afternoon when Mark left the room for a snack and casually handed me the controller saying, "Your turn." It felt like he had just handed me the keys to a ship I didn't know how to steer. My hands were sweaty, my brain raced. I stared at the screen like it might give me the answers, but it didn't. So I pressed something. Snake ducked. I pressed something else. Snake stood up. I pressed again and made him punch the air. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just guessing. But somehow, the guessing itself became beautiful. Each accidental move was a conversation, like touching piano keys for the first time, unsure of the melody, but fascinated by the sound. There was no tutorial, no pop-up helper, just me, the controller, and a screen that dared me to keep trying. And I did. I must have looked ridiculous, elbows high, tongue out in concentration, eyes darting across the controller like I was solving a puzzle carved into stone. But every button I pressed, every mistake I made, taught me something. The square button wasn't just a shape, it was an action, a possibility, a secret, just waiting to be unlocked with the right touch. I started to notice patterns, how holding the L1 button while pressing the triangle did something different, how quickly tapping versus holding a button could change everything. It was subtle but important. I was learning a language without words. And even though I kept getting it wrong, I couldn't stop smiling. Because every time I pressed a button, I felt like I was reaching into the game. Like I wasn't just playing, I was participating in something alive. Sometimes Mark would chuckle, not unkindly, when he came back and found Snake hiding under a staircase or spinning in circles because I couldn't figure out how to make him stop. But he never took the controller away. He watched, he encouraged, he knew I was hooked. Later that week, we tried another game, something different, colorful, a platformer with a mascot that had wild orange fur and big cartoon eyes, Crash Bandicoot. It should have been easier, but I still struggled. Avoiding traps, learning how long to hold the directional pad before letting go. It felt like learning how to walk again, but on a ledge, with TNT crates waiting to punish any misstep. I died 100 times in a single level, but each time I pressed restart without hesitation, because the controller had become something else. Not a tool, not a toy, a bridge, a way to connect with something beyond the screen. And the more I failed, the more I learned to listen, not just to the game, but to myself, to my intuition, my rhythm, my patience. I remember a day when I finally beat a level on my own. Mark had gone home early. I sat alone, barely breathing, hands tense, knees close to my chest. The final jump, a spinning enemy, a ledge just slightly out of reach. I pressed jump, then square, then forward. My thumb moved on its own, like it had always known the sequence. Crash landed, the victory music played, and I let out a shout that echoed through the empty living room. I had done it, not because I read a guide, not because someone showed me how, because I felt it. My hands had learned the language, my heart had translated it. And in that moment, the controller in my lap didn't feel like a puzzle anymore. It felt like an extension of me. From then on, every game was an invitation, a new dialect to explore. Some controllers were more complex, some simpler, but they all shared that same magic, the ability to translate invisible thoughts into visible outcomes, to turn hesitation into courage, confusion into clarity. Looking back now, I realize how much of life is like that. We don't always understand the buttons. We don't know what each one will do. Sometimes we press the wrong one. Sometimes we fail. Often, we're overwhelmed by the sheer number of choices. But still, we try, we experiment, we learn. And sometimes, in our failure, we discover something beautiful. That summer was full of small victories, learning how to aim in a shooter, learning how to drift in a racing game, learning how to lose without giving up. The controller taught me that, not with words, but with feeling. And even today, whenever I pick one up, I still remember that first time. The confusion, the laughter, the awe, and the quiet certainty that no matter how many times I failed, something magical was happening. There was a particular night, later that same summer, when everything shifted. The television was dim but glowing, casting bluish flickers across the living room walls. Outside, the world was silent. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. I was holding the controller again, this time less like a stranger and more like a trusted companion. My hands knew where to go. My mind didn't panic at every prompt. But that night wasn't about mechanics. It wasn't about getting better at jumping or sneaking or driving. That night, I discovered something else, something bigger, something deeper. We had rented a game for the weekend. Mark had talked about it non-stop, his words full of excitement I didn't fully understand. He said it wasn't like the others. He said it had a story. At the time, I didn't quite grasp what he meant. Weren't all games stories in their own way? A plumber saving a princess? A bandicoot stopping a mad scientist? That was the story, right? But this was different. The disc loaded slowly. The music that started was quiet, almost mournful. The main menu was still. No explosions, no dancing characters, just a vast field of stars behind simple white text. It didn't shout for my attention, it whispered. And then the game began. It opened not with action, but with silence. A voice narrated something about loss, about war, about searching for meaning. I didn't understand every word, but I felt them. Heavy, honest. The camera moved slowly, introducing characters not as cartoons or weapons, but as people. Real people, with eyes that carried weight, with expressions that lingered longer than they needed to, with pauses that made me lean forward. For the first time, I wasn't playing a game. I was inside a story. I didn't want to skip the cutscenes. I didn't want to rush the dialogue. I wanted to listen. I wanted to know why this character looked so sad, why another kept glancing away when she spoke. I noticed details I had never seen in any game before. A slow blink, a breath held too long, a crack in a voice. The controller was still in my hands, but I barely touched it. I was watching, yes, but more than that, I was feeling. When I did start playing, it wasn't about winning. It was about being present. The game didn't throw enemies at me immediately. It let me walk. It let me look around. I wandered through a devastated city, the wind echoing between broken buildings. There were no enemies, only ruins. And yet, I was terrified. I had goosebumps, because the silence wasn't empty. It was loud with meaning. That night, I forgot I was in a living room. I forgot the snacks beside me, the old couch I sat on, even the time. I was somewhere else entirely. There was a moment deep into the story when a character made a decision that broke my heart. Not because it was sad in the way a movie might be, but because I had been part of that journey. I had walked with them. I had chosen what they wore, what they said. I had fought beside them. And now they were hurting. I remember pausing the game and just sitting there. No tears, not yet. But something inside me cracked. I looked at the controller. I looked at the screen. And I realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't just entertainment. It wasn't just noise. It wasn't just a toy. This was art. This was storytelling. This was what books had done to me as a child, pulling me into places I'd never been, making me feel things I didn't have words for yet. But now, it was different. Now I was part of it. I wasn't just watching the story happen, I was living it. I thought of how my parents had dismissed it all. It's just a game. You're wasting time. Go outside. But I knew they were wrong, because nothing had ever made me feel this much before. No school lesson, no cartoon, no playground game. This was different. It was truth disguised as fiction, emotion encoded in pixels. And as I continued playing, that feeling only grew stronger. When characters fought, I felt tension in my chest. When they joked, I smiled out loud. When they wept, I didn't hold back anymore. I cried. Not because the game was manipulative, not because it forced me to, but because it had earned it. That's when it hit me. This was the future, not just of games, not just of stories, but of connection. In this new world, emotion wasn't something you watched. It was something you guided, molded, stepped into. The choices I made in that game had consequences. People remembered things I said. They reacted. They trusted or doubted based on me. And it wasn't about right or wrong. It was about humanity. The blurry line between fiction and feeling had disappeared completely. When the credits finally rolled, I sat still for a long time. I let the music play. I let the moment breathe. I didn't want to go back to the real world just yet. I wasn't ready to let go of those characters, that story, that truth. The screen eventually faded to black, but something inside me stayed lit. I looked at the controller again, and I smiled, because now I understood. This wasn't a toy. It was a mirror, a way to see myself, a way to understand others, a way to feel. And once you felt that, truly felt it, there's no going back. From that night on, I played differently. I wasn't chasing scores. I wasn't looking to win. I was searching for meaning, for empathy, for magic. And I found it, over and over again. In different games, different stories, different characters who showed me different parts of myself. But it all started that night. The moment I knew this wasn't just a game, and it never would be again.
I had never known longing until that summer. Not like this. Not the kind that keeps you awake with eyes wide open long after the lights go out. Not the kind that follows you into sleep, paints your dreams, and greets you again the moment you wake. It wasn't just about wanting to play again. It was deeper than that. I had touched something sacred. I had stepped into a world where I felt understood, where the loneliness of my thoughts had company, where silence wasn't empty, but alive with meaning. And now, all I could think about was holding that controller again. Not Mark's, not a borrowed one, not in someone else's living room, my own. That night after the game ended, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. I barely blinked. My body was still, but my mind was racing. Scenes from the story replayed in my head like echoes of a song I couldn't stop humming. I thought about the character's decision again and again, wondering what I might have done differently. I imagined alternate paths, different outcomes. I even imagined a sequel, though none existed. The connection I felt didn't end with the game. It had rooted itself somewhere deeper. It was now a part of me, and I wanted it back. Desperately. That was the night the obsession began. At first, I was subtle. During dinner, I casually mentioned how cool the game was. My parents didn't look up. My mother asked if I'd finished my vegetables. My father glanced at the news on TV. So I tried again, slipping it into other conversations. "Did you know games can tell stories now?" I said one morning, pouring cereal. My mother raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Stories," she said. "Like books?" I nodded enthusiastically. "Kind of, but you're part of the story." She didn't respond. She handed me my lunchbox and kissed my forehead. They didn't get it. They couldn't. So I tried a different approach. I started researching consoles. I learned their names, their prices, what came in the box, what you needed to hook them up. I read reviews in magazines I found at the grocery store. I stared at ads like they were maps to a promised land. I memorized the features, rehearsed my case like a lawyer preparing for trial. And when the right moment came, when I had a good grade to show or a helpful chore under my belt, I took the leap. "Mom, Dad, I was wondering." They both looked up. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. "Could I maybe get a PlayStation for my birthday or Christmas, or if I save up?" I watched their faces carefully, studying every twitch of muscle, every change in breath. My father sighed. "We'll see." Which, in their language, meant probably not. But I wasn't giving up. After that, the dreaming took over completely. During class, I stopped hearing the teacher's voice. All I could picture was the console, sleek and gray, resting beneath our living room TV. I imagined opening the box, the smell of new plastic,
The way the light on the power button would glow like a secret, being shared only with me. I imagined sliding the disc in, the soft whirl of the machine waking up. That sound, God, that sound, rising like a church bell in my soul. At night, I started having real dreams. Not vague ones, not strange ones. Dreams where I was there again, in the middle of a game world, running with familiar characters, solving puzzles, choosing paths. I woke up breathless, my hands twitching as if still holding the controller. Some mornings I couldn't tell if I'd actually played or just dreamed it. The line between the two kept blurring in the most beautiful way. I tried to earn it. I raked leaves. I washed dishes. I offered to go shopping with my mom, even though I hated grocery stores. I skipped snacks at school, trying to save every coin. I opened a small envelope in my drawer labeled Console Fund and watched it grow, slowly, pitifully. The price tag on the box at the store might as well have been the number of stars in the sky. Still, I dreamed. And the dreams didn't fade. They deepened. One afternoon, I stood at the window of an electronics store in town, my nose practically pressed against the glass. Inside, a demo unit played a looping video of game footage. Bright, sharp graphics, worlds spinning across the screen like postcards from another dimension. I watched the reel 3 times through before I realized my hands were clenched into fists. I wanted to be inside that screen. I wanted to go back. That night, I wrote a letter to myself. It said, "One day you'll have it. One day this will be yours. And when that day comes, you'll remember this feeling. You'll remember how much it mattered." I folded the letter and tucked it behind the money envelope. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but I had to try. Everything became about that goal. I made drawings of what my setup would look like. I even wrote fake reviews of games I hadn't played yet, pretending I was a journalist for a gaming magazine. I imagined interviews with developers. I pictured myself telling them how their stories had changed me, saved me even, because that's what it felt like. Everywhere else in life, I felt small, voiceless, invisible. But in games, I mattered. I had choices. I had impact. I had stories. And that idea of having my own world, my own stories, my own console, it consumed me in the best way. It wasn't greed. It was hunger. A hunger to feel that connection again, to feel understood, to be part of something that moved me, challenged me, inspired me. So I kept asking, kept hoping, kept dreaming, even when they said no again, even when the envelope filled slower than I liked, even when friends told me I was wasting my time. I believed, because that's what games had taught me, that the journey matters, that sometimes you have to fight for the magic, even if you're the only one who sees it, especially then. And so I kept dreaming all night, and I never stopped asking, because deep down, I knew it wasn't about owning a machine. It was about reclaiming a piece of my soul, and I wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever.
There was a time when the sliding glass doors of a game store felt like the gates to another world. I didn't need a pass. I didn't need money. I just needed to walk in and look up. There, on high-mounted televisions humming above me, entire universes played on loop. It was like watching windows to other dimensions, pixels flickering with life, colors too bright to be real, soundtracks echoing like distant thunder in a dream. And I would just stand there, still as a statue, mouth slightly open, eyes wide, letting the magic wash over me. I wasn't the only one. Sometimes there were other kids like me, drifting between aisles, drawn toward the glow like moths to a neon flame. But most of the time, I stood alone, ignored by the clerks, unnoticed by shoppers, just a quiet kid lingering too long, staring too hard, wishing too much.
The store always smelled the same, a mix of fresh plastic, paper, and a hint of electricity. It wasn't cozy, it wasn't even comfortable, but to me, it felt like home. I began planning my visits like a ritual. Saturdays became sacred. I'd wake early, skip breakfast just to get there faster, and make the half-hour walk with a mix of hope and anticipation building in my chest. The walk itself was part of the experience, half pilgrimage, half escape. I'd pass cracked sidewalks, sleepy neighborhoods, flickering street lamps that hadn't yet turned off. But once those automatic doors parted and I stepped into the chilled, fluorescent air of the game store, none of that mattered anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere better. I didn't touch anything. That would have felt wrong. I just watched. Some of the demo stations were built into walls with cushioned controllers locked in place. Some had tiny stools meant for kids to sit and try out a few minutes of gameplay. I never sat. I never played. I just stood off to the side, slightly behind others, eyes glued to the screen, heart thumping like a drum. The same game might play over and over again. An opening cinematic, a first level, a loop of a character running in place. It didn't matter. I would watch that loop 100 times if they let me, and they always did. I remember one game in particular, a sci-fi title. The character, a soldier of some kind, sprinted through a moonlit base while alarms blared and enemies fired in every direction. The graphics were mind-blowing at the time. Metal gleaming with reflections, shadows stretching across corridors, explosions blooming like fire flowers in slow motion. The loop ended just before a dramatic encounter, then rewound and played again. I must have watched it 30 times in one visit. Every detail etched itself into my mind like scripture. There was a moment, I can still feel it, where I looked at that screen and forgot who I was. I forgot the awkward kid with scuffed shoes. I forgot the quiet boy who didn't speak up in class. I wasn't standing in a store. I was in that world, running, dodging, saving lives, living a story that didn't begin or end with me, but needed me just the same. It wasn't just entertainment, it was immersion, a doorway into being someone else, or maybe, more truly, myself.
Sometimes, when the clerk wasn't looking, I would inch closer to the display cases. The glass shelves were like altars, lined with game boxes that sat upright like holy relics. Their covers were works of art, characters frozen mid-action, swords raised, spells cast, cars mid-drift, monsters mid-roar. I would trace the outlines with my eyes, reading the titles, memorizing taglines. I built wish lists in my head. I imagined which game I'd play first when I finally had my own console. I imagined how I'd tell the story later. This was the game that started it all. But for now, just watching was enough. It didn't feel like I was missing out. Not exactly. It felt like I was waiting, preparing, like a traveler at a train station who knows the ride is coming even if it hasn't arrived yet. My ticket was still unwritten, but the journey had already begun. One day, it started raining while I was at the store. I stayed an hour longer than usual, not because I minded getting wet, but because something new was playing. A fantasy game this time. Lush forests, soaring music, a lone hero with a glowing sword. I stood motionless as the demo played through. Then again, then again. The rain tapped the windows behind me, but I didn't look back. I barely breathed. It felt like the story had been made just for me, like the developers had somehow reached into my thoughts and turned them into pixels and sound. As I left that day, soaked and shivering, I realized I was smiling. Just from watching. That was all it took. Later, I started bringing a small notebook with me. I'd jot down names of games, descriptions of what I saw, details I didn't want to forget. I treated it like a field journal, as if I were a researcher studying an alien world. I'd sketch characters, write fake dialogue, imagine how I'd review them if I were a critic. In my mind, I wasn't just a fan. I was part of this world. I belonged here, even if I didn't own any of it yet. Sometimes the clerks noticed. They'd give me a curious glance, maybe a nod, but never said anything.
I think they recognized the look on my face, that wide-eyed hunger, that quiet awe. Maybe they saw a younger version of themselves. Or maybe they just knew I wasn't bothering anyone. I was just dreaming. Those visits became my lifeline. In a world that often felt too loud, too fast, too confusing, the game store was a still point, a place where nothing was required of me except attention, a place where the rules made sense and stories had meaning, where even in silence I felt heard. It was more than watching games. It was a form of prayer. I never told anyone about those Saturdays. Not my parents, not my friends. It felt too personal, too sacred to explain. They wouldn't have understood why I'd spend hours doing nothing. But it wasn't nothing to me. It was everything. Because in those glowing screens, I found hope. And hope was enough to keep me walking back, week after week, rain or shine. And every time I left changed. A little more certain, a little more ready. A little more sure that one day, this world would be mine too. Not just through glass, not just in dreams, but for real. And when that day came, I'd remember every loop, every frame, every hour spent standing still in a game store. And I'd whisper thank you. To the pixels, to the stories, to the magic.
It was a cold morning when everything changed. Not winter cold, just one of those oddly quiet days where the sky looks pale and the world feels like it's holding its breath. I woke up with no clue that something extraordinary was waiting for me. I had given up on asking, given up on hinting, but sometimes miracles don't knock, they just arrive. There it was, sitting on the kitchen table, the box, sealed, glossy, heavy with dreams. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My heart skipped once, then twice, and I stood frozen at the doorway, as if moving too quickly might wake me from a dream. My parents were pretending like it wasn't a big deal. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. That single, perfect box said everything. I approached it slowly, reverently, as though it were an ancient artifact that might crumble if touched too roughly. My fingers trembled as I reached for the edges. The plastic handle was still taut, stiff from the factory. The weight of it sent a current through my arms. This was real. This was happening. My PlayStation. I carried it to the living room like it was made of glass, my knees weak, my breath shallow. The box felt warm in my hands, like it had absorbed the energy of all my wanting. I sat cross-legged on the floor and placed it in front of me. I took my time. I had waited too long to rush now. Each movement mattered. Every cut, every peel of tape was part of a sacred ceremony. When I lifted the lid, the scent hit me all at once. Fresh electronics, plastic, styrofoam, something faintly metallic. That smell, if you've smelled it, you never forget it. It's the scent of promise, of possibility. It filled the room like incense. I inhaled deeply, almost closing my eyes. This wasn't just a console. It was a doorway to everything I had only dared to imagine until now. The styrofoam cradled the console like a jewel in a velvet box. I removed it gently, piece by piece. The controller, its wire coiled like a snake asleep. The cables neatly tied. The manual pristine and untouched. Each item was handled like treasure. My fingers hovered over the console itself, flat, gray, futuristic. I had seen it behind glass, in magazine ads, on demo stations. But now it was here, mine, real. I ran my hand along its surface, cool, smooth, unblemished. The circular lid that flipped open with a satisfying click. The buttons firm and responsive. The memory card slot, empty now, but full of potential. Every detail, every port, every inch of that machine was familiar from afar, and now intimately known. The controller felt heavier than I expected, not in weight, but in importance. It was a tool, a key, a bridge between me and infinite worlds. I held it the way someone might hold a pen before writing their first book, or a brush before painting their first masterpiece. I wasn't just about to play a game. I was about to create moments that would live in my memory forever. Hooking everything up took patience. The TV wasn't the newest. The cables didn't quite fit at first, but I didn't get frustrated. I didn't rush. Each connection was made with purpose. Each sound, the soft click of a plug, the buzz of electricity, was a note in a song I had been waiting my whole life to hear. Then came the moment. I sat back on the carpet, controller in hand, and turned it on. The screen flickered to life, first in a burst of blue, then black, and then there it was, that sound. That unmistakable swell of digital chimes rising from silence, like the birth of a star. That white diamond spinning in a void. That delicate balance between elegance and power. The PlayStation logo appeared in perfect symmetry, glowing like a beacon from a place beyond time. I didn't press anything. I just watched. Let it play through. Let the sound fill the room, the house, my chest. I was afraid to move, afraid to speak. It felt like the first breath of a new life. Eventually, the menu appeared, memory card, CD player, and the first disc I would ever insert, a demo collection that came in the box. It didn't matter what game, it could have been anything. I opened the lid, placed the disc like it was made of crystal, and closed it gently. A soft whirl, a low hum, and the screen shifted again. Suddenly, I wasn't in my house anymore. I was in a forest, a racetrack, a castle. I was chasing shadows, dodging lasers, jumping over pits. I laughed, I gasped, I leaned forward on my elbows, utterly absorbed. And when my parents peeked in an hour later, I barely registered their presence. They smiled and left me alone, as they should have. That moment, unboxing, connecting, beginning, it left a permanent mark on me. I didn't just receive a PlayStation that day, I received a new identity. A new rhythm, a new place to go when the world outside felt too heavy or too small. I stayed up late that night, way past the rules, long after the house had gone quiet and the city had gone dark. The light from the TV painted my room in flickering colors. The controller grew warm in my hands. My eyes burned, but I didn't care. I was no longer a visitor in those game store demos. I was a citizen of this new world now. A player, a dreamer in motion. I fell asleep with the controller resting on my chest, the blue standby light from the console casting a faint glow across the floor. And in my dreams, I was still playing, still leaping, still racing, still living inside that magic. It was the beginning of everything. Not just the games I would play or the stories I would fall in love with, but the person I was becoming. The person who had been waiting quietly inside me all along. I stayed up late that night, way past the rules, long after the house had gone quiet and the city had gone dark. The light from the TV painted my room in flickering colors. The controller grew warm in my hands. My eyes burned, but I didn't care. I was no longer a visitor in those game store demos. I was a citizen of this new world now, a player, a dreamer in motion. I fell asleep with the controller resting on my chest, the blue standby light from the console casting a faint glow across the floor. And in my dreams, I was still playing, still leaping, still racing, still living inside that magic. It was the beginning of everything. Not just the games I would play or the stories I would fall in love with, but the person I was becoming. The person who had been waiting quietly inside me all along. The first time I stayed up all night gaming wasn't planned. It wasn't rebellious. It was organic, an evolution of the new world I had stepped into. One moment it was early evening.
the sun still bleeding out through the blinds, and the next, it was 2 a.m. The house was silent, the kind of silence that only exists when everyone else is deep in sleep, and I was still wide-eyed in front of the screen, locked in, heart pounding. The clock had lost all meaning. What started as a hobby quickly became a rhythm, a lifestyle, a heartbeat pulsing just beneath the surface of my daily routine. Weekdays became bearable because weekends were promised. I would count the hours until Friday, until I could vanish into those games without interruption, without guilt, without limits. And those weekends, they weren't just time off, they were sacred. Friday nights had their own ritual. It began with pizza, always. There was something about greasy slices, melted cheese stretching in long threads, and soda fizzing loud next to a DualShock controller that felt like home. Sometimes friends came over, sometimes it was just me. Either way, the combination of food, flickering screens, and freedom became addictive. We would sit on the carpet, controllers in hand, surrounded by open pizza boxes, discarded socks, empty cans, and laughter that got louder with every victory and every ridiculous failure. The living room became our arena, our base of operations. We'd shout directions at each other, beg for revives, talk trash, and make up ridiculous rules for imaginary challenges. And when the game asked, "Do you want to save your progress?" we all leaned forward in reverent silence, because those save files, those tiny blocks of data on the memory card, they were priceless. They weren't just progress, they were proof that we had lived through something. Each game had its own slot, carefully named, carefully protected. If someone accidentally overwrote a file, that was grounds for war. We treated our memory cards like treasure chests, because they were. Inside them lived the final boss we couldn't beat, the car we spent hours customizing, the character we raised from nothing. Those bytes meant more than most people could understand. I still remember how it felt scrolling through the save screen. The PlayStation would load slowly, each icon floating into view, tiny previews of adventures we had paused but not forgotten. Each time I saw the words "load successful," it felt like reuniting with an old friend. Some nights we played until the sun came up, the light gradually replacing the TV's glow as our eyelids got heavier. I'd glance at the window and feel that moment of disbelief. How had hours passed so fast? The room looked like a battlefield of snacks and controllers and half-finished soda bottles, but we never cared. That mess was the aftermath of a night well spent.
Other nights were solo missions. Just me, the console, and a single-player story pulling me in deeper than I expected. I'd sit there, heart thudding as a cutscene played out, whispering to myself things like, "No way," or "I didn't see that coming," my emotions tied to the pixels on the screen. Sometimes I'd pause the game and just sit there, thinking, staring at the frozen frame, unable to move on because the moment was too heavy, too real. Gaming taught me patience, taught me how to fail and try again, how to search for hidden doors, how to backtrack when you missed something important, how to be resourceful when you had no ammo or no save point in sight. Every late night was a lesson, every checkpoint a reminder that even when it got hard, you kept going. The controller would leave marks on my hands, faint red impressions where the plastic had pressed too long. My thumbs got sore, my eyes burned, my back ached from hunching too long. But I didn't care. I wore those aches like medals. And then there were the conversations, the ones that stretched into the night, not about school or chores or real life, but about games. Which one had the best story? Which final boss was the hardest? Which memory card was cursed? We'd argue, laugh, swear loyalty to favorite titles, and silently agree that this weird mix of digital obsession and human connection was something we'd never outgrow. Sometimes, mid-game, we'd take breaks just to talk about school, our fears, who we liked, what we wanted to be. The TV would hum in the background, the paused game like a heartbeat holding space for us.
Gaming wasn't just escape. It was the glue holding parts of my world together that I didn't even know were breaking. And then came the bittersweet part, turning the console off. That moment of silence after the whirring stopped, the screen dark again, the reflection of myself suddenly visible. Those were the moments where everything caught up. The fatigue, the reality, the fact that Monday was now just a few hours away. But even that didn't matter, because I had saved the game. I had made progress. I had lived something beautiful. Years later, whenever life gets chaotic, I sometimes catch myself daydreaming about those nights. The smell of pepperoni and melted cheese, the low hum of CRT TVs, the flashing light on the memory card when saving, the laughter of friends who didn't need much, just one more round, one more level, one more chance. Those nights weren't just about video games. They were about freedom, about belonging, about joy that didn't need to be explained. And even now, when the world feels overwhelming, I close my eyes and remember that flickering screen, the warmth of shared laughter, and the weight of a controller in my hands. And I remember who I was, who I still am. I was halfway through a cutscene, one of those long, beautifully rendered moments where the line between game and cinema blurs so completely that your hands fall away from the controller without even realizing. The characters were speaking in hushed voices. Rain was falling in perfect rhythm on digital rooftops. The lighting, the music, the pacing, it was pure magic. My room was dark, except for the flickering screen, and I was completely still, absorbed, heart caught in my throat. And that's when my dad walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway with a look I couldn't quite read, somewhere between confusion and curiosity. I thought maybe he was going to ask me to turn it off or lower the volume, but instead, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes still fixed on the screen, and said quietly, "It looks like a movie." It was such a simple sentence, unscripted, casual, but it hit me in a way I didn't expect, because it wasn't just a comment about graphics. It was a bridge between worlds, between his and mine. My dad, who grew up with radio and black and white television, who thought video games were just noisy toys and distractions, had stopped in his tracks. Not because of a high score or a flashy explosion, but because of story, because of atmosphere, because something had stirred him in a language he understood. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just my thing anymore. What I was witnessing on screen wasn't a game in the old sense. It was art, it was cinema, it was narrative, it was music and direction and voice acting and emotion. It was a full-fledged experience handcrafted to move people. And it moved him, even if just for a moment. My dad saw what I had seen all along. This medium wasn't about pushing buttons. It was about being transported. I invited him to sit down. He hesitated, then walked in slowly, settling onto the edge of my bed. He asked who the characters were. I explained as simply as I could, trying not to overwhelm him. He asked why one of them looked so sad. I gave him a brief version of their backstory, skipping the dozens of hours I had already invested into understanding them. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he said, "This is different. This isn't like Pac-Man." We both laughed, because it wasn't like Pac-Man. Not anymore. What I was witnessing on screen wasn't a game in the old sense. It was art. It was cinema. It was narrative. It was music and direction and voice acting and emotion. It was a full-fledged experience, handcrafted to move people. And it moved him, even if just for a moment. My dad saw what I had seen all along. This medium wasn't about pushing buttons. It was about being transported. I invited him to sit down. He hesitated, then walked in slowly, settling onto the edge of my bed. He asked who the characters were. I explained as simply as I could, trying not to overwhelm him. He asked why one of them looked so sad. I gave him a brief version of their backstory, skipping the dozens of hours I had already invested into understanding them. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he said, "This is different. This isn't like Pac-Man." We both laughed, because it wasn't like Pac-Man. Not anymore. We had crossed a threshold. The technology had evolved, sure, but so had the storytelling. Games were no longer just about reflexes. They were about decisions, emotions, relationships, meaning. You could feel things through a game, real things, things that stayed with you long after the screen went dark. And I was part of that. I had grown up alongside it, pixel by pixel, title by title. I had seen the evolution happen in real time. I had been there when worlds were first imagined in jagged polygons. I had heard the first awkward voiceovers and watched them become Oscar-worthy performances. I had struggled through crude camera angles and clunky mechanics, all so I could eventually arrive here, in this quiet moment beside my dad, sharing something that, for the first time, he truly understood. It made me reflect on just how far I'd come, from fumbling with the controller, pressing the wrong buttons, not even knowing how to jump, to being able to anticipate plot twists, decode level design, and recognize a composer's soundtrack by ear. My relationship with games had deepened into something personal, something sacred. It wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was identity. It was comfort. It was home. We watched the rest of the cutscene together. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was impressed. And when it ended and the gameplay resumed, he stood up, gave me a light pat on the shoulder, and said, "Keep playing." It was the first time he had ever said that. And I did. I kept playing. I played through heartbreaks and graduations, through uncertain jobs and long winters. I played when I needed to escape, and I played when I needed to feel grounded. The console changed, the graphics improved, the stories got more complex, but that feeling, that electric pulse when you hear the intro theme, that never changed. I think that's what I love most about it, the consistency in an inconsistent world. And now, years later, I still return to those moments. Not just the cutscenes or the boss fights, but the memories layered in between. The quiet click of a memory card being inserted, the crinkle of plastic as a new game is unwrapped, the low hum of a loading screen in a dark room, the smell of pizza, the sound of laughter echoing through a childhood home, the voice of my father saying with awe in his voice, "It looks like a movie." It did look like a movie, but it felt like life. This wasn't just a toy. It never was.